again with Kylie Stedman Gomes to continue our conversation around the cycle of Kairotic Flow. Kylie, we ended off yesterday with our conversation around town planner. We covered the orange side of things, moving from pioneer to settler and into town planner. And today we're moving into the purple, starting with steward and then moving on to curator and then scout. And in looking at steward, it makes the way that you describe it here as maintaining and nurturing what we have, guarding the sacred, nurturing the whole and the spaces in between. And I thought that this maintenance function of steward really makes sense coming out of town planner. Could you just talk a little bit about that transition from town planner to steward?
Sure. So town planner is really focused on the actual standardizing and automating of processes. So sort of bedding things down so that they become a kind of infrastructure. So it's more focused on the process and on the knowledge itself, whereas steward is starting to move across to the applying to context and applying to people and meeting needs. So taking all that information that we've got and that we've sort of settled into something that we know well and applying it. So you see it a lot in like health or education. You see it in like police, army, any of those sorts of things. So you've got a structure, and then you're working within that structure to do what needs to be done to look after the well-being of the whole.
Okay. Well, then it makes total sense then, because the number of times that we've talked about steward, teachers always come up, right? And given my background and my work and teacher education, that that makes total sense. These are the people who they're the practitioners, right? And I think this is a really good opportunity because one of the things that it's sort of a pet peeve of mine. I know that on your chart, there's a tension between town planners and scouts, right? And I think that tension between town planners and scouts kind of carries over to stewards a bit, particularly teachers who have been, I think, taught to view themselves as practitioners. And that frequently means for them that they have an aversion toward theory. And theory seems to me to be like a more scoutish kind of activity. But I think that stewards would be well served not to define themselves too rigidly, as practitioners, because that theory practice dichotomy I view as being a false one, because what they're actually doing in stewarding is they're practicing a theory, right? I mean, their practice is grounded in some kind of theory, whether they're aware of that theory or not, right? And so perhaps they're putting the theory into practice, and they feel committed to serving, those ends and whatnot. But do you agree that that tension between town planners and scouts can carry over into stewards?
There's certainly some similarities between the tension between scout and town planner and between pioneer and steward, which is that both town planner and steward are sort of, they're quite solid phases in the sense that it's not relying on much change, that like both are really interested in best practice and transparency and doing things in predictable kind of ways. So they're sort of providing a stable base for things. Both scout and pioneer are like gaseous phases. So it's like not much is known. It's like it's high learning at that point, and very rapid cycles of learning. So it does sort of turn out to be like the Scout and Pioneer are kind of looking at theory and initial experimentation, whereas Town Planner and Steward are kind of like, well, we've proven, we've got evidence that this works, whatever this happens to be. And so look rather askance at something that is actually very risky by its nature. So there's that sort of similar flavor there. But also there is in between types that are too away from each other on the cycle, there's also a bit of blindness, or not really sort of seeing with depth the purpose of what the archetype that's too away is, because it's in a way it's like it's neither the supplier nor the customer of the archetype, and it's also not the one that's in direct opposition. So between Steward and Scout, there's a bit of a not understanding entirely, or what's being done looks a bit like black magic, I have to say, for me, because my home archetype is actually Scout. I just look at Steward with wonder, like, how do you manage to keep plants alive? And and how can people raise children this way? This is amazing.
Yeah.
So, but the other side with the Steward archetype is because it's concerned about the well-being of the whole. If you are within that scope of concern of someone who is stewarding, then there is a very nourishing kind of acceptance there as well. So I mean, my mother is the Steward archetype, and she just kind of watches me and go, I do not know what you're doing, but my daughter and I love you. So,
because I can appreciate the steward's role to maintain things, but sometimes in becoming too obedient to the town planner's desire for standardization. I mean, there are actually principals out there in the schools, headmasters of schools, who say things like, if I'm walking down the hallway and I know that these 3 classrooms is right now, all these teachers are teaching English or social studies, whatever the content is, right? The teachers should be covering the same, all 3 teachers should be covering the same material at the same time, virtually saying the same things at the same time. And it's like, stewarding shouldn't be just parroting things, right?
Yeah. Although there's another interesting dynamic to kind of comment on that I've noticed before, which is that the archetype before whatever it is that one is doing, or someone who is like really strongly centered in the archetype before your own, any critique that's coming from them is particularly devastating, because they provide your food. So I have that sensitivity to critique from Curator, for example, and so on. So
we talked about that before. I raised the issue of maintaining the integrity of the theory, whatever it is, or the idea that was originally sort of discovered, as it were, or created by scouts, right? Because the pioneer might pick up an idea, and then their application of it sort of like completely violate the sort of integrity of what the scout really had in mind. And so maintaining open communication between the various roles, I think, is pretty important.
Yeah, well, it's sort of maintaining almost an advisory role, but the advisor needs to let go too. Kind of, we're no longer in the specialty area.
I can appreciate that. Looking at the established goals for Steward, The first one is being able to identify when stewarding is needed and what it needs to accomplish. At what point in town planning do you think stewarding becomes appropriate?
So, well, there's a couple of ways to look at it. So one is that when there's nothing that sort of needs to be standardized any further, and you can kind of tell that because maybe things are getting a little bit too tight or a little bit too regulated or something along those lines, then it's time for town planning to stop. And as soon as it's time for town planning to stop, then it's time for stewarding to take over. So there's that. And there's also just that like sort of building an infrastructure, which is what town plan is doing. There's kind of a point where you go, okay, it's built, and now you sort of hand it over to operations or to continuing whatever it is. So at the point that a hospital is built, for example, then you move on to where it needs repairs and cleaning and all of that kind of stuff. So that's just a natural transition to stewarding.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second of the established goals is maintain standardized systems that serve the well-being of the whole, apply them to meet needs, and communicate any exceptions or failures. And so this sort of anticipates the role of the curator a bit, right? In the application of things, stewards can still modify things so that they're it goes back to that idea of optimization, right? So the system is in place, it's been standardized, it's been institutionalized, but the steward is more than just maintaining. It's also trying to make sure that it works to the best of its ability, right?
Yes. Although to some extent it's kind of looking at the system that's been built and sort of trying to repair it back to how it was designed in a way.
Right.
But also in the application of things, like if you think of what a general practitioner does as a doctor. So they've got all of that information there, the best of what's known to pull from. And so they're looking at, hopefully, the human being as a whole person and figuring out what symptoms are showing up and drawing in the processes and the approaches according to what's actually needed. So yeah, I mean, curator kind of comes in at the point where steward finds that a system has failed.
Right. Yeah. And that kind of brings us to the third of the goals: understand what is needed for the well-being of the relevant holon and appropriately apply what is known to attend to those needs. I think one of the issues that sort of shows up often in times is that people end up serving the system rather than the people that the system is intended to serve, right?
Yeah.
So if the goal is to understand what's needed for the well-being of the relevant holon is actually whatever purpose is meant to be served, right? Or whatever person or non-person is intended to be served. But you're not just serving the standardized system.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the character from the head nurse from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest earned her name Nurse Ratchet quite appropriately, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit more of the trying to keep the system going rather than looking after the patients, for sure.
Yeah. In terms of the desired understandings or the big ideas behind steward, the first one here is what is known would not always be appropriate to meet real needs of the whole, and there are always some trade-offs required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's an example actually that Dave Snowden refers to a bit, which is within a hospital system. There used to be at least a role known as the matron, right? And it was quite an emergent role. And what the matron would do would be to look at all of the spaces in between the system and the needs, and work to fill those gaps. So I've kind of got where I'm talking about steward in the definition itself, I'm kind of saying that nurturing the whole and the spaces in between.
Yes.
Sometimes it's the spaces in between that need the most attention. So when they decided that they didn't need, for some reason, the matron role anymore, because they cost too much, or there just wasn't a space for it in the architecture that had been designed, things started to fall apart much more quickly.
Right.
That the space in between wasn't being stewarded properly. So yeah, so these are trade-offs to an extent, because the matron was actually not just doing steward by itself, by alone, but was very much looking at okay, what little bits of innovation are needed to fill this tiny little gap here, so that they were continually doing that balancing between steward and pioneer.
Because we have to remember that these are human beings in all of these roles, right? Mm-hmm. And all human beings have blind spots. Mm-hmm. And so town planners in their standardization, they have blind spots. And it's that stewarding role, looking out for the spaces in between, which are essentially perhaps the blind spots of those who did the planning, and then try to account for those, right?
Yeah. And well, sometimes it's blind spots, but it's not necessarily just that. There are some things that you just don't want to standardize. You don't necessarily want to bring everything into the standard or into normal. So right. the tale of Procrustean bed, yeah. So that idea of you don't want to go around chopping off people's feet and whatnot because they're the wrong size for a bed.
Yeah, right. Oh gosh. Go ahead and spell out the Procrustean bed story, so that people who are not familiar with it will understand what we're smiling about.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I don't know enough to say where it came from exactly, but Procrustean was I think an innkeeper who really wanted to provide excellent service for the travelers that came through and would stay. But part of that, he thought that beds should be the right size for people. And that meant that there was only a certain amount of distance between head and foot of the bed and head and foot of the person. Right. And so if the person was too short, to make sure that the bed fit them, he would stretch the person and put them on a rack. And if they were too big, then he would chop part of them off to make sure that they actually fit the bed, or the bed fit them. And we can get into that if we try to regulate things too much, because we are actually all unique. There may be norms, but trying to push everything into those standards doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah, it puts me in mind of the people who developed here in the States a piece of educational reform legislation that was passed in 2001. It's called No Child Left Behind, right? I think I may have mentioned it yesterday, but their aim, and they were trying to require schools and be accountable. This is part of the whole accountability movement for teachers, is that all students were expected by 2014 to be reading and doing math at grade level. And that included special education students as well.
That's Procrustean.
Yeah. I mean, the poor teachers were expected to do what medical science could not do, and that is to cure people of whatever developmental disabilities that they may have had that landed them in special education in the first place. So
I assume this has since been dropped because it was either impossible or recognized as being Procrustean.
Well, the planned punishment for schools not getting all kids up to grade level was to shut them down. And by that standard, they would have had to shut all schools down. So yeah, it got dropped. We might have been better off, but yeah, that was, I think they did. I mean, it's typical for school reform, though. One presidential administration comes in, does its thing, and the next administration comes in and everything changes. And so, you know, that's what happened in that case.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking, so this sounds a bit like Kronos and Procrustes in cahoots.
Well, they would want to work together, right? I mean, so heavily focused on standardization of time, everything is quantitative, test scores, all these sorts of things. And the crazy thing about the whole teacher accountability movement, holding teachers responsible for test scores, teachers can teach all they want. If the kids don't care, if the kids don't do homework, if they don't really apply themselves, there's only so much that a teacher can do, right? It just reminds me, this was absolutely insane. One school district near a university where I used to work, they developed this diversity plan. And you can imagine a diversity plan being many different things, right? But this district's diversity plan boiled down to requiring teachers to go out to meet with the parents, make home visits, and try to convince the parents of the importance of their children performing well on the end of grade, end of course tests. That was the diversity plan.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me actually, one of the, and maybe worth talking about, one of the issues with trying to impose diversity requirements is that it tends to be quite Procrustean, in the sense that one would hope that the whole that was in question is the actual child or the actual person.
Right.
And what is required for their well-being. If diversity or a certain quantitative measures of diversity made into the goal, then what you end up with is not considering the actual children that are there, but instead focusing on the makeup of the group.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just the wrong level, I think, to be focusing on. It's the wrong whole.
Well, it's a good example. It's a really good example of what you were talking about yesterday, with sort of like measurements becoming the goals, right? And the final established goal here is understanding what is needed for the relevant whole and applying what is known to attend to those needs.
I think, have we moved on to the understandings?
Oh, you're right. We have. I apologize. The first one is what is known will not always be appropriate to meet the real needs of the whole. And there are always some trade-offs required.
Yeah, so we talked about that one with the matron.
Yeah. And it kind of goes back to the blind spots, right?
Yeah. And I suppose we've actually just been going through the next one, which is that the real needs of the whole are always more important than the systems built to attend to them. Life comes first, maintaining systems comes second. So
yeah, it's really interesting how just in the course of our conversation around this stuff, maybe we've talked about it so much that this is the direction that the conversation flows in. Right?
That's why we do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And the last one we kind of covered already too, the tension with pioneer. Considering opportunities to do things better is crucial. Hospice for the dying can be the most appropriate trade-off.
Yeah. So if a system is not working anymore, we don't necessarily just want to throw the whole thing away. We want sometimes to just have a gentle decline. And you can see it with people, with human beings. Like palliative care is important. You don't just want to keep people alive no matter what the cost is. I don't mean financial cost, by the way. I mean cost to them and cost to family and the quality of life matters as well, not just
prolonging their suffering, right?
Yeah.
I think my own mother was sort of she had Alzheimer's, and I think she suffered for like 10 years where she didn't know who she was, where she was, or anything else. And for all intents and purposes, she was not our mother anymore. She was a body. Her mind was still sort of functioning, but she was no longer the same person. But anyway.
Yeah, it's responding to the circumstances that are there.
Yeah. In terms of our essential questions, can you talk a little bit about what circumstances dictate the necessity of trade-offs?
So there's when it just doesn't work straight off. So, for instance, that matron example was a good one. So where there is nothing that actually applies directly. So if you're kind of saying, oh, okay, this doesn't fit perfectly, then you need to start looking at the trade-offs of trying different things, which is more of that pioneer approach. So the tensions basically are the trade-offs in a way. So it's like if it's a perfect fit, then you wouldn't do it. If it's not, then you need to sort of step out of just applying the things that exist and start looking more broadly.
In talking about this last essential question, what does it mean to guard the sacred? I think so much of our conversation about the cycle of Kairotic flow sort of emerged during our conversations about the commons, right? And guarding the sacred in the context of the commons really puts a spotlight on certain sorts of things, certain kinds of questions about what is sacred, right? But within a business or institutional context, and we'll get back to the commons element of things, but going back to the hospital or the school or whatever, what would qualify as the sacred in those contexts?
Okay, so for the hospital, it should be the health and well-being of the people. For education, it should be the learning and the understanding of the people, rather than the institution or keeping the organization going in whatever shape it's in. I mean, we can see how much we do that ourselves. There's a phrase in English, and I kind of mean like UK English, if something is not cricket, right? And it's sort of referring to the sacredness of the underlying spirit of the game. So bad sportsmanship or cheating or any of that kind of thing. It's like we sort of regard something about whatever the game is as being sacred. And that sort of comes first over just winning or whatever. It's like it's kind of a case of the ends don't justify the means.
That's what I was just thinking. Yeah. And going back to the commons, I mean, it's terrible that the pursuit of profit has done so much to this. Well, profit's the only thing that's really held sacred. The things that are really sacred, like water and air and just the soil, are totally disregarded. There's not supposed to be anything sacred about them.
Well, we think of values too, like the values of justice, for example, is something that we hold sacred, we may not agree on what that looks like at all times, but nobody likes it when, let's say, money allows people to buy their way out of a criminal charge, for example. Because we hold that value of justice actually more highly ourselves than we consider money to be.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that notion of the sacred for the steward is of, absolutely critical importance.
Mm-hmm.
Because what are you really stewarding? The institutions, the power structures, the hierarchies, or are you serving them? Are you serving the sacred? And in some sense, I think all of the archetypes should be mindful of that as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's just that steward has a particular guardianship role.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas curators are sort of about trying to find it, figure out what is and isn't serving it, if you like. Yeah, I won't go into the.
No. That's a great segue for moving into curator as our next archetype. You describe it as selecting what is best from what's available, what to keep and what to dispose of, and how. What is fit for its purpose? What needs to die? What needs to be kept and or brought back to salience? I can see the curator playing this role as like, okay, we're to the point where the institution is no longer serving the sacred. We need to take a look at what elements of it are worth preserving and which elements need to be gotten rid of or transformed or replaced with something else.
Mm-hmm.
At what point, I mean, is that really the point when curation becomes needed, when it becomes evident that the current way of doing things is no longer serving its desired purpose? It's no longer serving the sacred.
Pretty much, yeah. So purpose and sacred, sometimes we're looking at something that's a bit more surface level, I guess, than what we would call sacred. But there's still like an underlying functional reason that we're doing something. I mean, you could think of something like a car, for instance. You could get to the point of going, it's no longer worth repairing. But what parts of it might actually be worth keeping and putting into another car? So sort of sell I don't know what you call them in the US, but there's basically scrap metal kind of gets pulled out, and sometimes the engine might still be fine or something like that, and it gets put into a different.
We call it a salvage yard.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just funny because my brother had 6 kids and not a tremendous income. And so whenever his car needed a part, he would go to the salvage yard. And sometimes he would take me with him, and we would have to like walk through looking for whatever kind of car he had at the time and see if it still had that part in it or not. I don't even know if those sorts of options are available to people anymore.
In Australia, they are in some way or another, but I don't know if people can just go looking for their own stuff.
Oh, okay.
You probably have to order it or get someone who specializes in it to do it.
Well, we've become so legalistic in things like this. I'm sure that there's liability issues in terms of allowing people to climb through that stuff. And if they hurt themselves, they can sue the salvage yard or something like that. It's ridiculous. But no, I mean, some of the stuff that we share in common is sort of affinity for the conversations that Daniel Schmachtenberger has been having around the meta crisis, right? And I think the problem of trying to curate, the mess that is the meta crisis, figuring out, just looking at, because it's become apparent to a lot of us that our systems that we have in place, however limited they may have ever served the sacred or served the good of the whole, are clearly not serving the good of the whole any longer. And trying to figure out what to preserve and what to eliminate. It's a challenge. It's an overwhelming challenge.
Oh, it certainly can be. And Daniel Schmachtenberger does brilliant curation. Absolutely brilliant. So
yeah. You were saying something to me yesterday about something that he said recently, that sort of like, I think, speaks to this. Do you remember what it was?
Well, it's not so recent. It was during one of the Great Simplification podcasts with Nate Higgins.
Okay.
But there's this 5-minute snippet that I'm actually writing up a response to.
Oh, that's right. That's where it came from.
And so what he was pointing at in that was that people, when they're trying to solve the problems of the meta crisis, they say, well, it's all about economy, or no, it's all about education, or it's all about parenting, or it's all about the media, or something like that. And his basic argument there is that, like, all of the problems need all of the solutions.
Yeah.
Which is that's a take on it. I'm putting my own take on it. That's Kairotic Flow based, but I'm still writing.
Yeah, let's come back to that. Yeah, because my take on it would be everything's fucked up. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And a lot of some of the more recent stuff that I was just thinking about was completely predictable. At the university now, while we say that we're trying to grapple with artificial intelligence, they're doing everything they can, it seems to me, to try and promote it. The chair of a committee that I serve on recently used artificial intelligence. She posed some questions. I'm not exactly sure how she did it, but this document that we're supposed to be reviewing for our next meeting was actually generated by AI. And I can't wait to have a look at it to see what AI came up with, how much damage control we're going to have to do to fix whatever it was, But that's completely predictable. Universities have a long history, sadly, of receiving taxpayer subsidy of some sort or accepting corporate money to do research leading to the production of labor-saving technologies that put the people who are not so privileged to work at a university completely out of work. And so now, with the introduction of artificial intelligence, what I fear is that perhaps the universities have finally chopped their own heads off. They've created a technology that will allow, for their labor to be saved. We no longer need professors. We have artificial intelligence to teach us.
Yes, well, I suppose the thing to bear in mind is that artificial intelligence really probably should only be dealing with playing a very secondary role with anything other than perhaps town planner, because it's based on the information that we've actually released in some way or another. And because AI is not human, it can't get into that proper stewarding role of safeguarding what is sacred to humans.
I mean, it can only think through the algorithm that's used to program it, if I understand it correctly. And given the people who are, defining the regulations and writing the algorithms and things like this, what's his name? Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, wrote a book not too long ago with Henry Kissinger about artificial intelligence. And if Henry Kissinger is having anything to do with establishing the aims and directions of artificial intelligence, it's completely predictable that it will be used for nefarious purposes. I mean, every movie that's ever been made about artificial intelligence has become dystopian at some point, and how we can expect reality not to be dystopian with the use of AI just sort of baffles me. I feel like a total Luddite when it comes to this sort of stuff. And the other part of me was like, are you kidding me? We are so lazy, we don't even want to think anymore. We need a stupid machine to think for us. Now, we're better off sort of like doing stuff on our own, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I can see a very useful place for it, but
it's not going to be limited to those useful spaces.
Yeah, well, the conditions that it's operating in, and I'm going to say namely market conditions, make it impossible for it to actually serve humans in a way that's overall healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to serve those who own the markets.
Mm-hmm.
Which curators need to step in here, going back to our goals. Review and analyze failures and exceptions to understand the gaps. Is there any kind of context you can think of where you could describe how that would play out?
Yeah, so what's normally going to happen from the perspective of let's take a car again. The car stops. It's not working.
Okay. It's happened to all of us.
Yeah. And unless we know enough and can dig in and figure out what's gone wrong, like what it was that actually failed, we would just be in the position of having to throw the entire car out. But it may be for want of I don't even know what parts of the car exist anymore. I'm just thinking of traveling with my parents as a kid. The fan belt died in the camper van that we were in while we were in Morocco, and my father had to hitchhike back to Gibraltar to get a replacement. But the thing is like if he hadn't known to do that, then we just did not have a functioning vehicle anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's basically kind of digging in to find out what it is that's actually failed.
Curating it entails a very strong diagnostic role.
Oh yes, yeah. It's that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Picking up the babies.
Yeah.
Making sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And we need to have trustworthy curators, because people blame the wrong things for problems, on a regular basis.
Yeah. We tend to go straight for something that's visible, and that gets ourselves out of the mess as quickly as possible.
Right.
Rather than necessarily looking for what actually caused the problem in the first place. So.
And too often, I think our curators invent stories to throw us off the scent of what's really at the heart of the problem.
Yeah, or things that are ostensibly curation are trying to be run under conditions that make actual good curation impossible.
Yeah.
So it looks straight at media for that, right? So what is it? What is the purpose of media? Well, we're trying to find out.
To serve the corporations that give them their advertising money.
Okay, what's the sacred purpose of media?
Yeah, well, to participate in the process of maintaining an informed, critical thinking citizenry, right?
One would hope so. Yeah, yeah, or at least just knowing what's going on and what's going on that's actually relevant and information that we need to know in order to make effective choices in our lives.
Yeah.
And when instead it's about making profits, then what makes profits is not necessarily what we need to know in our lives. It's far more likely going to be, how do we get the most advertising money coming in? How can we hijack people's attention? How can we get people paying attention to this rather than to something else? So those incentives are just, they make good curation pretty much impossible.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose that educational reformers fall in that line, but the people doing the educational reform they really have no background in education. Yeah, I still remember kind of around about the time that I got into education, there was a national report here in the States called A Nation at Risk that really kind of launched the entire high stakes testing and accountability movement the preceding decade, right? But in that report, this National Commission for Excellence in Education, they always give themselves these names, right? That this is their goal. They want excellence in education. They don't really want excellence in education. That's beside the point. But they effectively, the argument was this: American corporations can no longer compete in the global economy. And the reason they can no longer compete in the global economy is because American workers are so stupid. And American workers are so stupid because our schools have abandoned their commitment to standards, right? Back in the 1950s, when America was an unrivaled economic superpower, it was because of our schools and their commitment to high standards. And so the lesson to be learned is to return to our commitment to standards. And it was completely town planner in its logic. It just took them a while to develop whatever standards that they were going to come up with. But to credit our schools for the United States being an economic superpower, I ask my students this all the time. Okay, in the 1950s, okay, what was the condition of the economies of America's economic rivals? And what led to the condition of those economies? And even undergraduate students in my classes will tell us that World War II, I mean, the industrial infrastructure of Japan and Germany and all these other countries were destroyed, but the United States industrial infrastructure was basically left untouched. But not a single person in the media did anything to criticize this report. Its assumptions, everything about it was just accepted as if it was the sacred. And now we are morally committed to return to standards. It didn't blame, American corporations were, American workers weren't doing very well because of American corporations' decisions to outsource the manufacturing base to countries where workers were even less educated, which was another flaw, But the workers in places like China and the Pacific Rim and Central America and places where these manufacturing jobs went, they had no other option but to shut up and just go to work, which is what they wanted American workers to do. But American workers had unionized and they were demanding high wages, and the environmental movement was going on, and democracy became a problem. Anyway, that's going well beyond. We just need better curators.
Well, not the people. We need conditions for curating.
Yeah, yeah. Identify that the other, we're off track a little bit, but the third established goal is identify clearly what needs are unmet and where calibrations and/or new possibilities are required to bridge these gaps. Does this point in some direction to a kind of relationship between curators and scouts? Because that's what we'll turn to next.
Yeah. So, well, when something fails, when a system fails, so that will sort of first come up in Steward, that something is failing. But the underlying needs, or what the sacred is, may well have been kind of lost in that process. So it's like the system might fail, but you know what, those needs actually could be getting met somewhere else. And it's actually all about the needs of the purpose that you're trying to serve in the first place. So identifying clearly what the needs are that are unmet is crucial to be able to do sensible things from that point onwards. And when I'm talking about recalibrations, sometimes it might just be, oh, we thought that we were building for this particular thing, but as it turns out, that's actually not quite the right standard. It might just be a mistake or something like that, and you just turn it a little bit. Or it might be, oh, that we actually really had a good way of doing that before, but we've forgotten about it. We kind of got caught up with something that was new and shiny that turns out to not actually be as good as what we had before. So then it's kind of like pulling whatever that thing is out of storage and dusting it off and cleaning it up and maybe retuning it, and then you've got something that's perfectly viable.
Right.
Yeah.
But you actually have to be interested in serving the sacred, you know, for those things to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And not just sort of interested in an intrinsic motivational sense, but to also not have too high a cost attached to it. So when we think of whistleblowers and so on, there aren't that many of them because it requires a degree of bravery to go against the conditions that they're up against, to actually feel it to be important enough to risk their reputations, their livelihood, maybe their lives, and that of people that they care about. So,
sometimes I wonder myself if teacher education serves the accrediting agencies, or if we actually serve the communities in our states that pay our salaries, And you think about the question of the sacred. I mean, what schools play a role in teacher preparation is preparing the teachers to work in those schools. For most parents, nothing is more sacred to them than their children, right? And what education is, what schools actually, one of the roles the chief role they perform is to play some role in helping parents and society to raise children. And that's a sacred responsibility, if I can think of one. And if you want the support of parents, you have to be able to convince them that you're actually playing that role. But I don't think many parents have a lot of confidence in those institutions either. And one of the reasons is because they have their own recollections of their experiences when they were in school. But it's something that people need to keep in mind when they're talking about the purpose that these institutions ought to serve. And maybe that's actually a strong pathway back for us, is redefining. Let's be open and honest in our efforts to redefine the sacred.
Yeah. I mean, we have to be, especially now, perhaps, So I can't remember whether we mentioned yesterday that if we look at global civilization as a whole,
Yeah.
and what archetype or what phase it's in curator at the moment. It's the trying to figure out what's sacred, what needs are being met or unmet. A lot of the arguing between groups and the arguing for rights and trying to find accountability and all that. This is all a very poorly conducted, but it's nonetheless a process of trying to find out what matters. It's trying to get down to like what are the needs that are unmet and what are they supposed to be. Now there's a bit of trying to jump to solutions, which is not useful.
We're not ready yet.
Yeah. But it's a very human thing to do. And we can kind of see how important curation is at the moment. Because if we don't curate properly, curation is the step towards being able to reestablish integrity of the whole, because it's the integrity that started to fail, and we need to figure out how to reestablish it. And if we can't sort of look down to find out what the essence is that the integrity is sort of supposed to be wrapped around, then the whole lot's just going to fall apart. So.
Well, I mean, I suppose that this might be an appropriate place. We only went so far yesterday in our conversation around power. And our current town planners hire the scouts they want to hire to find the solutions that they want to have for what they identify as problems. But what they identify as problems isn't necessarily what a steward or a curator with any integrity would identify as a problem. And so as the consequence of the power of our dominant institutions, the big banks, the big investment firms, and their media and their pharmaceutical industry, all of these other industries, they've lost sight of this sacred. What's sacred to them, again, I mean, it's the big banks and the investment firms. It's dollars, right? And that's the sort of world that's been created. And it's not a surprise that everything else would fall down when that's the only thing that these dominant institutions seem to be concerned with.
Yeah. Remember with Settler when we were talking about Goodhart's law of a metric that becomes a goal ceases to be a good measure?
Yeah.
Metric in this case is money. When money becomes the goal, then it ceases to be a good measure of value or of sacredness or of whether something is worth doing or not.
Right. I think that's one of the reasons why I've always looked at cryptocurrencies as somewhat offensive. I mean, it's kind of like, I know there are people who earn their livings by playing cryptocurrency markets and things like this. And I don't know, other than making money, I don't know what those things do.
Now I'm reminded of David Graeber's bullshit jobs.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's like OnlyFans for people with an MBA.
Oh, I don't even know what OnlyFans is.
It's a vehicle for people to basically make their own amateur porn, and people can subscribe to their channel to watch them do whatever they do on their channel.
Right. Yeah. The taking marketing of an extrinsic valuation of oneself to the absolute.
Yeah, Facebook is full of shorts, reels, or whatever they call them on Facebook, of young women in particular trying to seduce you into visiting their OnlyFans site. And Zuckerberg or whatever is allowing this. It's just one of those other elements of the bread and circus that we're being, that we're being given to distract ourselves from what's really going on in the world.
Yeah, that's a symptom of a not very healthy system.
Yeah, it seems like anytime I post anything on Twitter, I get someone who follows me who claims to be a female, young female, right? And they usually have like 3 posts that are supposed to be theirs or whatever. And if I follow them back, which early on, whenever this started happening, I sometimes did because I didn't know, right? But then I get a text, direct message from one of them, and they want to start a conversation, and inevitably they say it becomes like a sexual thing, and I'm like, you know what? I'm not so arrogant to think that some random 20-year-old is going to reach out to some random 63-year-old and want to establish a relationship. I'm like, either you've got a really weird kink or something's really fishy here.
Well, it reminds me of this conversation I was having with Uber support at some point, because I think actually it might have been Uber Eats, because there was something that was supposed to be there, or a delivery that was supposed to be made that wasn't actually made, and then we got charged for it. So I'm trying to work my way through this chat kind of process. And I just kept getting back this stuff of, oh, no, the driver said that they rang the bell. And it's like, there's no way that they rang the bell, because I was sitting right freaking next to it, like this, in this time that they were supposed to have done it. So they obviously didn't. Oh, no. And then it's like, oh, no, they said that they called you. And I'm kind of like, well, I mean, calling is not what they're supposed to do. I mean, it is in the instructions to ring the doorbell and knock on the door, right? Anyway, and I just kept getting this whole no. And it's like, eventually I just got irritated and I wrote, are you a bot? I discovered that this was the trigger to actually get a human being on a call.
Right.
So that's the thing. It's like you're getting chased by bots.
Okay. Yeah, right. And so now whenever they follow me on Twitter, I just block them. Yeah, like immediately. As soon as I yeah, right.
Block a bot.
Block a bot, yeah. I really wish that Mr. Musk would do something to rein this kind of crap in. But yeah, there's a whole lot of curation needs to go on.
Mm-hmm.
Just looking at the understandings, let me just read through these really quickly. Systems were created for a purpose. That purpose may still be important, even if the system is no longer fit for that purpose in the current context. Well, maybe not so quickly, but I think that another way of looking at it is we need to redefine the sacred, or define, in each context, a sacred needs to be defined. What are we really serving?
Yeah. What's the need? What's sacred? What's the purpose? What are we doing? What is it that we want here?
And it's really tragic because I think people are so alienated. I mean, Marx, nailed this 150 years ago. I mean, when the sole function of having a job is making money to support yourself or whatever, it kind of gets back to perverse incentives, right? Mm-hmm. You don't value the work for the product it produces, or for the value that lies in doing the work itself, right? You're just selling your labor, selling your energy to serve some alien purpose. Mm-hmm. Alien in the sense of like, it's sort of foreign to you. It's foreign to us, actually.
Yeah. But so that systems were created for a purpose, and the purpose may still be important even if the system is no longer fit for it. Education is a perfect example.
Yeah.
It's like we need to learn and need to be able to learn continuously and be able to figure out our way in the world. So, and that was, I suppose, the purpose initially. It's always been the purpose of learning. But the system that's been created, the compulsory school system,
Right.
is not doing that anymore. It's not preparing for the world that's coming, that people are going to need to be able to navigate their way around.
No, we don't need a school for that. We need an armory.
Or we need to learn some scouting techniques.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I've mentioned this to you before, but Slavoj Žižek, I forget which book, cites Lenin whenever any of the comrades, the communist Bolsheviks or whatever, were trying to achieve some end and they failed, or they met a roadblock or something like this. Lenin's advice was to begin at the beginning. Don't try and find a way around where you're at now. Maybe you started from the wrong place. Maybe you started from the wrong assumptions or something. But go back to the very beginning. And I think as a civilization, that would be very good advice for us to take. And I know that we can't physically go back to the beginning of the emergence of our species or something like this. But we can think back to that and ask ourselves, what are the first questions? Why are certain things sacred to us? And what's always been sacred to us, and why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not the beginning in time. It's the beginning of the underlying need or the sacred, or what are we trying to do here? And I mean, I really hope that most of the time that we're trying to sort of further life.
It's important to go back to the very beginning, to reimagine ourselves as having none of what we have now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we haven't even reached hunting and gathering yet. We're just sort of like scared as shit because there are saber-toothed tigers. There are these, short-faced bears that are 14 foot tall. And we're on the menu. And we had to learn. I mean, unlike them, we're not very fast. We're not very strong. We don't have claws or sharp teeth or anything like this. One of the first things we had to learn how to do was cooperate. And our capacity for symbolic thought that allowed for language greatly enhanced our abilities to cooperate. And we need to appreciate that. That's the hardcore bottom line of what you just said about learning. We always had to learn. We've had to learn how to do certain things in order to survive. They're not just genetically encoded in us,
mm-hmm.
And that's never stopped. But that sense of awe about how small we are and how weak we actually are individually, and sometimes even collectively, in the face of cosmic things. We don't know when the next meteor shower is going to rain down and completely transform the climate for 1,200 years or something like that, like it did. Last time that happened was just 15,000 years ago, with younger Dryads. It can very easily happen again.
Mm-hmm.
But we're concerned about our OnlyFans accounts. Are you fucking kidding me? This is what we've come to,
Well, look, I'm just glad that you're making a reference that I do not need to go and look up.
Yeah, don't go look it up. Don't go look it up. Okay. And what's frightening to me is that my stepdaughter and my son both stepdaughter's 18. My youngest son is 25. They defend OnlyFans. Well, if people can make money doing that, who cares? And I'm like, the fact that people are making money doing it, and not only making money, making millions of dollars, some of these people. So it's not so much casting moral judgment as it is like, this is what we've come to. This is what people have been reduced to make money. Circling the drain, as George Carlin said.
Yeah, there's a huge conversation to have about that at some point. Not now.
Yeah. Not now. No, and it's only perfect, on the surface, it would often appear that the whole system has failed, even when it is only a small component that is no longer fit for purpose.
Yeah. So we were talking about that with the car before.
Yeah. Oh, we did. Yeah. Because that points right back to Schmachtenberger and the meta crisis, right?
Yeah.
There's a tension between curator and settler. Considering what does work that could be improved is crucial. Ensure the baby isn't thrown out with the bathwater.
Babies in bathwater is a very good way to think about things when it comes to curation.
Yeah, because oftentimes babies do get thrown out, right?
I mean, yes, not literally, but
well, yeah,
sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, an example of that was around the George Floyd stuff with defund the police. It's kind of, you take the entire concept and you just take the money away from it. It's like, so first of all, money is not the way to be to be measuring the goals or dealing with the incentives or anything else. And there is a purpose to having police that you don't want to just throw out willy-nilly. Doesn't mean that nothing needs to be done. It doesn't mean that that the system is working, but at the same time, that is throwing babies out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I mean, that whole George Floyd thing just opens up so much that we'll discuss that at maybe in a different context or something like that. Because in terms of curation and things like this, I think we could really tease that apart in a number of different ways. But we'd have to add like another 3 hours onto our podcast. So
we would. So okay, let's just point at the Consilience Project.
Yeah.
Like pretty much everything that they write is doing this kind of curation and making sure that we're not throwing babies out with bathwater.
Okay. Well, then I guess we should provide a link to the Consilience Project down below whenever we're done.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe at some point, Daniel will link to us at some point, or link to you. This is your cycle. You'll throw me out with the bathwater. That's okay.
I thought you just said you were too old to be a baby.
Don't throw old men out with the bathwater either. And it's so funny because our last of the essential questions, and I think we've covered all the essential questions just in the course of the conversation. I guess once again it points to why they're essential. And finally, we come to Scout, which I think is a role that we both identify with, exploring and mapping the realms of possibility and risk, including probing around in the compost of the dying for acceptation. Okay, possibilities. Why is the notion of Scout appropriate for this role?
So Scout is not assuming anything about what they're going to find. They're going out into the unknown. Right. So they're looking for certain things. So driven by need, if you like. But it's just finding out the lay of the land. without any preconceptions about what's going to be there. The only thing that matters is good observation, orientation, knowing what the possibilities are and knowing what the risks are, because that's the information that you need in order to be able to make wise choices, wise decisions about what to do next. I originally called this one shaman.
Okay.
It could also be called something like explorer or philosopher.
But why shaman?
Shaman, because they're looking at different states. They're stepping outside the realm of normal and going way into the unknown.
Different dimensions of reality.
Yeah. And so there is something that's very accurate about it, but it's also too precise.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you don't need to take psychedelics or be in a tribe or perform rituals in order to scout. You could, but it's not a
prerequisite.
It's not a prerequisite, no. So
I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, but I mean, because there's been all sorts of interesting research recently around psychedelics, and just from my own experience, it's a different state of consciousness, and it helps you look at things in a completely different kind of way than I think was even possible before. I just finished reading Graham Hancock's book Visionary, and he spent a great deal of time with shaman and having lots of experiences using ayahuasca and the Amazon and things like this. And it's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. It's a lot of really just talking a lot about his experiences and also some of the research that's been done around these topics. But I understand perfectly why, because I mean, the notion of shaman, we're all familiar with scout, right? We kind of know what scouts do, So I wouldn't suggest changing the name from scout to shaman at all. This is more appropriate. The second of these established goals includes explore and sense into the field to discover more about as yet unknown possibilities for and risks around meeting needs. I had just a question about what you mean here by sensing into the field.
Okay, so I said I was starting to write something up in response to that video of Daniel Schmachtenberger's, right?
Yeah.
And I'm using this metaphor of sailing. All right, so when you're on a boat, you've got this field of information around you, right? So you've got information that's coming in about the wind. You've got information that's coming in about what the water's doing. You've got information about the like landforms that are around. You might have some news coming in that's sort of saying what kind of weather you can expect. You've got the people around and you're seeing how they're actually responding to things. You've got movement of the boat, and you've got feedback through either the wheel or the tiller, right?
Yeah.
So all of that is information from the field. So you're basically just expanding out to have an awareness of what's out there that's relevant, right? So it's this sort of continual relevance realization, to use this term of John Vervaeke's. And it's like you don't know what it's going to be, so you just got to stay open and see what comes up, what emerges. And as it comes up, then you can sort of attend to it a bit more closely and figure out if there's any sequencing in there or if there's anything else going on that you can't see. Is it something that you can interact with directly, or is it just suggesting that there's something else going on that you can't directly see? I mean, wind, for example, it's like you can't see wind, you can just see what it's doing to other things. So by sensing into the field, it's basically whatever it is, whatever the relevant context is that you're looking at from the perspective of that whole one. So let's say that you were talking about what might help a particular child to learn the language or something like that, and you'll find out, well, what are the supports that they've got around them? What are the things that they clearly know already that could be used for scaffolding? What's their home life like? Do they have the time and space to be able to focus and concentrate? So that's the field kind of around that child. And so you're looking for what the possibilities are, and what the risks are, or what the obstacles are that are relevant to the question that you're holding.
And it really points to, once again, the importance of learning, just because in order to be able to work your way through these things, there's just so much that you have to know. And whenever you don't know something, it points to the need to go learn it, right? You know, one of the problems, of course, is sometimes we don't know what we don't know, right? And so if we don't know what we don't know, we can't know to fix it. You know, it's really the quintessential kind of source of our blind spots, as it were. Expert blind spots, as they say in curriculum theory. But the idea of looking out for as of yet unknown possibilities. Moving on to this next goal, discern relevance and map what is discovered as neutrally as possible. We talked a little bit about discernment before. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of discernment, particularly as it relates to being able to discern relevance?
Okay, so there's a kind of staying open that's necessary. So I'd actually go back almost to look at settler again as having an important role to play here as well. It's like, instead of focusing on a particular measure or a particular metric or a particular goal, it's instead figuring out what is relevant to whatever the needs are that you're holding in the field around you. So the being able to discern that is to be comparing its possibilities with relation to the need that you're holding, not something that's actually external. So if you've kind of put up, like, is it relevant to making money? It's like, unless the making money happens to be the real need, then that's not relevant. If it does happen to be the need, because in today's world, actually, sometimes it is, then you are discerning relevant possibilities for meeting that need of making money. So, I mean, ideally, you're doing something other than that, because it's not the best actual marker of anything that we really care about.
Right.
But it is the case that has to happen fairly frequently now. I got a little sidetracked before because there was a quote that jumped straight into my mind when you were talking about the things that you don't know.
Yeah. Oh.
Or that you don't know that you don't know. And it's this quote from Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And this is perfect for Scout, right? Not knowing is fine. Like, you can just open up and sense into what you don't know. And just basically it's a sort of accepting what comes and seeing what starts to emerge out of the mists, if you like. But if you have this preconceived idea of what you're going to find, then you're in trouble. If you're resting things on an assumption that this is how it works and so on, then you can end up really heading off in completely the wrong direction. So
I've seen it happen so many times, particularly in a world that promotes such heavy specialization. in very narrow fields. And so we end up with a lot of people who know a great deal about this one narrow band of reality or something, right? There's so much that they don't know that they don't know, that they can't possibly make the connections between why that's relevant or what's relevant to that. So that capacity for discernment really hinges on sort of, for the lack of a better term, sort of multidisciplinary understanding, But the way we go about school, nothing, no content area, no subject, nothing relates to anything. John Taylor Gatto, who's a famous sort of critic of compulsory schools, even though he taught school for like 40 years, he says, I teach the unrelating of everything. Nothing's connected to anything. And it's so spot on. I mean, we don't learn anything about the history of math. We know nothing about the history of science. And sadly, I mean, we don't even have religion classes here in the United States, but we have people walking around here who define themselves as Christian, but view Catholics as being non-Christian. It's like we have people that don't even know the history of their own church. I mean, the level of ignorance, But and then you look at what people do know about celebrity culture. And it's not their fault. I mean, it's what the operating system has programmed them to do. I mean, look at what we've done to natural intelligence, and now we want to develop artificial intelligence. Yeah, that's going to work out real fucking well.
Especially since it learns based on the things that are actually out there.
Yeah.
It's all right. We'll just get to the point that we know. There's some quote that I can't remember exactly, but it's along the lines of learning more and more about less and less until eventually you know everything about nothing.
Right. Yeah, there's this map and this notion of being the map of what you discover. I mean, mapping the stuff that's relevant is so hugely important, right? I mean, I think one very useful tool for people to have a look at are the 4 quadrants that Ken Wilber developed: the individual interior, the collective interior, the individual exterior, and the collective exterior, which really boils down to our biological selves, our psychological, psychic selves, our social selves, and our natural selves. Those things can be broken up into various parts, but they still form part of the same whole, right? And of course, I don't know about you, but my first encounter with the notion of a holon was through Ken Wilber, right? And so this holonic approach that you're taking, I think that in the broadest of terms, everybody could use those 4 quadrants as a place to start configuring their maps, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of thing that applies across contexts is really helpful. So the interior and the exterior, and think of even just a cell, again, to go back to the cells. It's got what's going on inside the cell and what's going on, what the cell is responding to outside itself.
Right.
And also the cell is a part of a greater whole of some sort.
Yeah, an organ, for example.
Yeah, and it's also paying attention to what's going on in the holon that it's part of, internally to it. But then also, because the holon itself needs to pay attention to what's outside of it, the cell sort of needs to pay attention to what's outside of the holon that it's part of as well. So yeah, when it comes to mapping, that sort of thinking is really helpful. But I mean, I think thinking in terms of dimensions in general is really helpful. And so that's sort of looking at internal and external dimensions and partness and wholeness dimension. Looking at time is interesting. looking at structure, looking at energy, like all sorts of different lenses that we can apply.
Right.
And you can see some that are breaking down a lot. I mean, a lot of things that we assume are based on old information that's not actually true anymore. So if you think about like all of the governance systems that formal government systems that we've got set up, usually a few hundred years old, and sort of at the time, information moved slowly and was quite scarce. That's sort of what it went at the rate of horse. But natural resources that were abundant, but also it seems like almost limitless, right? So the value that was placed on those two things, right, has been based on information being scarce and natural resources being plentiful. Now we've got basically the opposite situation. So we're still treating information as if it's scarce and slow when it's not. It's exactly the opposite to that.
Yeah.
And treating natural resources if we can just like waste them, because hey, obviously there's heaps of them, right?
Right. What's the latest figures on how often our information doubles?
Oh my goodness, I don't know. I've lost track. Human knowledge is doubling every 13 months.
Wow. That's crazy.
But we are apparently quickly on our way, with the help of the internet, to the doubling of knowledge every 12 hours. In 1900, human knowledge doubled approximately every 100 years.
Yeah, I'd like to look at how they're defining knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I don't know about the knowledge. I think maybe it's like data.
Twitter posts, right?
Yeah, so this one is business analytics. I find it actually fascinating that that they use the word knowledge.
Like, it's fitting that we should end on Scout, because I think it's been precisely, you've been playing this role of Scout as you've explored and continue piecing together the cycle of Kairotic Flow, right? And I get the impression from conversations that we've had that a lot of Daniel Schmachtenberger's work sort of like set your inner scout sort of in motion. Not that the inner scout wasn't always there in you, right? But could you say a little bit more precisely about Schmachtenberger's message that you found so compelling that you're going to incorporate into the video that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I mean, so that will probably be an article even before it's a video. But so in the video, Daniel talks about all of the problems need all of the solutions. So he's trying to find ways to think how to think about the problem, rather than sort of attaching to particular frameworks, or to sort of blame education, or say that the education or economy or health or whatever is the thing. So what I'm kind of looking to say about Kairotic Flow with this is that dividing things up into those different categories is the problem, right? We need to be able to look at systems or look at life while it's still living. And that's what Scout is so good at. And that's what Kairotic Flow is good at too, because guess what? Kairotic Flow is really a bit of a Scout map, right?
Right.
And the difference is that by doing that, centering need and sensing into the field, and not trying to pre-categorize anything, not analyzing, just observing what's going on and letting what is relevant to awareness, it means that we can better deal with things that are changing very rapidly. So I don't know if you know that expression VUCA, which is VUCA, so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. All right. If we try and apply let's say, solid frameworks to something like that, well, nothing sort of stays where it's supposed to stay. So it's like we're kind of chasing after something with a ball and chain around us. It's like it's just too slow. Right? We need to be much more light-footed. And that's really what Scout brings to the table. So as Daniel is curating and getting down to the core of the problem, he's not only talking about the meta crisis, he talks about generator functions. He talks about needing a third attractor and so on. So he's kind of bringing these needs very clearly to the fore. And the next phase, the next archetype that can deal with what he's presenting is actually Scout. Right? But Scout in our world is pretty much invisible at the moment because Scout doesn't have a product. All right. Scout is not a job title. Scout is not considered to be productive. Scout is considered to be only theoretical. There's all of these things that it doesn't look like what people generally consider work to be, because it's a continuous sensing and mapping, and that's pretty much all it is. And it's not providing maps that are of the sort that we think of with say street maps, especially if you think about the old printed versions, right? You print a street map and it's going to stay the same for at least a year, and if you're like I used to be, hold on to it for 10 years and it's still relevant enough. Can't go to a new housing development and find your way around, but otherwise you could. It's more like the kind of GPS that's sort of providing continuous information about whether there are radars there, and also bringing in the weather map, like as it is actually at the moment. And if there's roadworks or what the traffic conditions are. So it's a far more rapid changing sort of thing. So it's still mapping. It's still showing you where the possibilities and risks are so you can make choices. But it's not something that is based on the kind of infrastructure that even something like Google Maps is. So Google Maps is sort of based on that the roads don't move very much. So it's just it's a layer over the top of it. Whereas the kind of scouting that needs to be done now, or the kind of changes that we're needing to make, are going to be in multiple different dimensions. We need to question all of the assumptions around the governance structures that we've got in place. We need to question the assumptions about how we think we know what we know, and whether that's actually correct or not. Going back to that Mark Twain quote before, assuming it is Mark Twain. You see, you question yourself because you kind of go, hang on a minute, that might not be correct. It's looking at things like, okay, we've got something new that's come out in the terms of AI and the cryptocurrencies and a bunch of different things like that. But what assumptions are they actually based on? What's the underlying need here? And is this actually a decent way of looking at it or not? And I mean, I think that there are big questions around a lot of those things. So we assume, for instance, with AI, that it's par for the course, that obviously it's something that needs to exist in the market, and that it's quite okay for like a limited subset of people to own it and charge for it and treat it as something to compete with each other about.
Yeah.
Is that a good assumption? I mean, I would suggest that it's not. I think it's of an entirely different nature than the kind of things that made sense to create the property concept around in the first place. So, and if that's not a good assumption, what do you do?
I mean, if we look at the meta crisis, and it is a meta crisis, I mean, virtually all of our institutions in various dimensions of our lives are in a kind of crisis state.
Mm-hmm.
I still think that there's a kind of common denominator there. Sherry Mitchell is a Native American woman whose work I've shared with you. And she talks about a mind virus
Mm-hmm.
that started, well, not that this is necessarily the origin, but I guess it's the original act of separation, of viewing things as if they're separate from everything else. That was the sort of like the first sin. She describes it as the first sin, which is not totally inappropriate, because one of the many things that I learned from Ivan Illich, that the original definition of sin was, or sin meant turning away from the other, particularly the other if the other is in need. And Sherry Mitchell points out that within her indigenous traditions, the major concern is if everyone has enough. Not are you rich, not are you whatever, but do you have enough? And I think the other person whose writings we share in common is Paul Levy, who writes about Wetiko. And I think that this mind virus that Sherry Mitchell is talking about is the same thing that Paul Levy is talking about with Wetiko. It's this sort of the capacity for evil, and we see it manifest itself all over the place. A number of years ago, people started writing about neoliberalism. And when I started reading about it, it dawned on me that there's really nothing neo about it particularly. It's economic liberalism just gone nuts. And of course, the basis of economic liberalism is economic liberty, economic freedom, the freedom of profit seekers to do whatever, serve the sacred, right? Do whatever is necessary to serve the sacred. And for them, that means profit, regardless of the consequences for anything or anyone else. And I think therein lies the one thing that I think we see most across the various dimensions of the meta crisis. But you could trace that evolution all the way, the evolution of these problems, all the way back to whichever scout it was that came up with the idea for economic liberalism.
If they actually did.
Huh?
I said, if they actually really did.
If they actually really did, yeah. But even that can be probably traced even further back than that. But it's like we need a civilization level reboot. We really do need to begin at the beginning. And I think that the cycle of Kairotic Flow sort of points us in that direction. I'm sure that people could use it for making sense of and apply it to their daily lives in the here and now. But as an approach toward solving the meta crisis, I think it holds promise.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's just such a focus on what the next right step is.
Yeah.
And you're talking about education before, and that report that you were talking about, which I might sort of describe as we're not upholding standards, and it was that we were upholding standards that put America in this good economic position.
Yeah.
Right. Now there was some sort of a failure of the education system as it was. Now where it needed to go from there was actually to Curator, right? To figure out what the underlying needs were that weren't being met, where the gaps actually are. And that means sort of going into community again to figure out what's actually required. But instead it was like trying to pull it back against the flow and into town planner, which is never going to fix anything.
Right. Yeah, right.
If the archetype that fixes the problems that are created or that can't be fixed by the archetype before it, it's always the next archetype.
The report that I'm referring to is called A Nation at Risk for people who are interested, right? 1983. But it was propaganda. And so the real crisis, and particularly the crisis in education, were the conditions that allowed for that report, number one, to be written, that someone would lie that fucking blatantly in order to affect the desired result, right? Because everybody knew that the American working class, black, white, brown, male, female, gay, straight, the entire American working class was suffering. But you're not allowed to point your fingers at corporations for that suffering. It's the school's fault. Complete misdiagnosis of the problem. So in that sense, you're right. But the failures of the education system stem from more people not having either the knowledge or the guts to call bullshit on the report itself. Now, there was myself, and then David Berliner and Bruce Biddle wrote a book called The Manufactured Crisis. To some extent, people like Susan Ohanian, people were questioning elements of it. But the way in which we ceded over our minds, as it were, to the government to create these schools, to quote unquote educate us, I suppose that we shouldn't have expected anything different. I mean, really, when you look at it. Of course, the state and the interests that it serves, which are market interests, is not going to allow for anything that doesn't serve its interests, what it holds sacred, which is its power and its profit. And so even our system of collective learning, I refuse to, well, I try not to use the idea of education anymore in conversation, because anytime that I talk about education, people think I'm talking about schools. And so I kind of shifted to talk about our patterns of collective learning. And I think one of the points of our connection, our sort of personal, professional connection, is the kind of alignment between the cycle of Kairotic flow itself is pointing to it is its own kind of system of collective learning, right? But at every step of the way, we really have to ask ourselves, what are we holding sacred here? What's our purpose? And two of the things that we have to hold sacred across all of those dimensions, I've mentioned before, accuracy. We may not always be right, but God damn it, we have to try to be right. And then honesty. We just can't fucking lie anymore. Stop it. I mean, now if the media is moving their lips, we know they're fucking lying. The same for our politicians. If they're moving their lips, you just sort of like, they're lying. That's got to change. I don't know how.
Well, I mean, we need to change the conditions in which they're operating. And that means changing it's not so much the change, it's not about the change, but it's about, instead of focusing on the institutions and keeping the institutions going, instead going, what do we actually need and what's fit for purpose and so on. Going back to we're in a curation phase, but we've gotten so addicted to the comfort of feeling like the illusion of security, if you like, that comes from, I mean, yes, it's a myth of separation, but we've managed to successfully separate and isolate ourselves from the environment around us. But things are changing so fast that the institutions actually are less and less and less secure. Doesn't matter how secure they look, they're less and less secure.
Yeah.
And so we can't rely on them. Like that we're not trusting them is not a sign of us doing something wrong or the people in the institutions doing something wrong even. It's a sign of them not being fit for purpose anymore. The way that they're structured is just not it. We can't go back. Do you know what I mean? Like we can't go back from failure back to town planner to get the standards right. Like we have to go through the pulling things apart, looking for new possibilities, testing those out, and so on. We have to go around the flow. As the more we try to go backwards, the worse it gets.
That's a great point. You know, I mean, I was just thinking about the illusion of my security. I mean, hold on just a second. Right now here in Eagle, Idaho, it's not too terribly cold. It's 46 degrees Fahrenheit. But I'm very happy that I have central heating in my house so that I don't have to experience 46 degrees. Because that's still kind of chilly, right? Less than fully comfortable. And then I think about everything that was necessary to make this artificial environment that I'm in possible, that separates myself from that. You know, it's just another matter of curating and teasing things apart, you know, and asking ourselves what our priorities are. So, yeah. So where are you carrying things from here with your work around the cycle of Kairotic Flow?
Well, at the moment, I have a campaign up on Indiegogo, which is sort of seeking some support to actually sit down and write a book about this, because at the moment, it's still in me. It needs to get out of me and sort of available to everyone. It's like sometimes I feel like I'm like a walking instrument of it. So there's that. I'm also doing coaching and consulting and so on around it as well.
But you need the time to be able to write.
Yeah. So.
And you're not independently wealthy, so.
Well, hence the campaign. It's basically, it's sort of, I suppose it's a head order of the book, and it's join the community and join conversations. And for people who are interested in getting some coaching or consulting, it's like they get a certain number of hours in exchange for however much they put in support as well. So it's kind of just turning the tables on time a bit, because usually I think when people are writing, they're creating an asset that they're later going to sell, which is fair enough. But I'm kind of in this position of, I think Kairotic Flow needs to be out now, not in honestly, it would probably take me 6 years to write this at the pace of time that I actually have at the moment. So, yeah. So anyway, so that's why the campaign's there. I have, as you might anticipate, I have kind of plan B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, sort of lined up as well to fall back on. But yeah, the main thing is to actually just get it out as fast as possible and get people trained up or apprenticed up in it, if you like. Eventually, I want it to be in the commons. I want people to be able to access all of it.
Right. Yeah.
It will take a bit of balancing to get there, because I need to live, and I need to set up the materials, which means hiring people and all of that
Yeah.
kind of, but yeah.
So we will be sure to post a link to Kylie's fund below, and encourage everyone. And I understand that not everyone can give, but to those who can and are financially able, I beg, strongly encourage you to please contribute toward her so that she can get this book out sooner rather than later. Otherwise, Kylie, thank you for the work that you're doing around this. I really do think that it's important, and I hope everyone else finds it, equally important. Anything else you'd like to say to close?
Just a general thank you to you and to the other people who have been listening to me rabbiting on about Kairotic Flow now for goodness, it first started actually in 2020, so it's been going on for a while, but I get so much out of the conversations. It's like, I was describing it recently as it's almost like an echolocation thing that I'm doing. So people come up with a word and I'm like, does that feel like it's quite right? Oh yes, that one's a good one. I wrote it down. So it's the time and encouragement and everything else means a lot.
Oh, great. All right.
And that includes the interview. Thank you.
Happy to do it. Well, we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.